I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro from my perspective. I'm Abby Rose. I'm the CEO at Vidacycle. We make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. And many of you may already use Soil Mentor, or at least know of Sector Mentor, or at least know of it, which is our app for vineyards. So Sector Mentor makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health and biodiversity, track vineyard activities block by block, and much more. And in many ways, this observational approach and learning from trends in your own vineyard, which Sector Mentor supports, that is at the core of regenerative farming. And so we have this huge privilege in terms of working with customers and collaborators who are also amazing regenerative advisors and practitioners. So it's really exciting to have you here tonight, Mimi Casteel, and also next week it'll be Sergio Nicolau, because you're some of those people who are constantly expanding the way we think about farming and helping to put into practice what we're committed to at Vidacycle, which is building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. So thanks everyone for joining. We really wanted to nourish a discussion about what it looks like to apply regenerative techniques across the UK, US, and New Zealand viticulture worlds, as well as further afield. And so that's what the Regenerative Viticulture Series is about. And we first launched it in 2021, and at that time it felt very nascent and kind of scary. But 2 years on, it feels like those kinds of conversations are buzzing. There's a huge desire to share and learn more from fellow practitioners. And so we're really excited to be back and to dig in. A quick practical note about Zoom. Great to see people in the chat sharing where you're from, but if you have any specific questions, could you ask them using the Q&A functionality on Zoom? There you can ask the question and then people can upvote someone else's question, and we can then see the questions, because at the moment we won't be watching the chat. So today I'm really excited to be talking to Mimi Casteel. Mimi, well, viticulture has always been part of Mimi's life. So what you'll see through the conversations, like Mimi, you have an unbelievably deep understanding of vines and vineyards. And then added to that, you did your master's in forest science and biology. And then that brings a whole different perspective to the vineyard and really a unique regenerative approach, which I really appreciate, which is very much focused on the whole system. So Mimi has also recently been hosting some of the No-Till Market Garden podcasts with some great in-depth interviews that I highly recommend tuning into. And you're also on the board of the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation, which I know we're going to share a bit more about later on. So to get started, Mimi, maybe you could just tell us a bit about your background and where you're at.
Sure. So I'm joining from Oregon, from my home farm. And like Abby mentioned, I grew up in viticulture. I grew up on my family's vineyard. And really, my first love, my first imprint was the forest that surrounded us. And so when I left home for university, I actually had a brief period of time where I thought I was going to be a neurobiologist and went pre-med, and then just kind of fell down the biology hole and realized that I didn't want to work in a laboratory. I wanted to work in the forest. And so the brain part is still a fascination for me, but I got very deep into forest ecosystems and worked for a good chunk of time in public land management, so doing research in our national forests, and then came back to farming because of some pretty intense discovery that some of my research was just uncovering for me and making me realize that the things that I really felt very strongly needed to change the most were the things that were happening on private lands. And at least the way that we carve things up in America, the discourse, in terms of where we have agency to actually change what the landscape looks like, is always around public lands and what we consider the commonly held properties, but they're very, very small in comparison to what is under private management. And so I felt very compelled to get involved there if I wanted to make a difference in what the future was going to look like, and the natural world. And so that was the beginning of this chapter of my life. And very recently in 2021, my family and I moved from my previous site, which was a much larger farm, an 80-acre piece, 30 under vine, to a much smaller vineyard and kind of a homestead farm. Really wanted to downsize and not be in the business of selling fruit to other winemakers. I really only wanted to grow what was for me, and also be able to work more in other types of agriculture with other practitioners who were doing regenerative practices or wanting to get on the regenerative path in different types of agriculture. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
Brilliant. Yeah, and actually, you can go on your website, Mimi Hopewell. It's really, I love reading your blog posts and your musings on the journey. So definitely recommend tuning into those. But maybe we can start with actually your recent move to that new site, because I know that part of the joy of that site is that you're able to do many experiments. And so I would love to hear about some of those experiments. What are you experimenting with at this new site, and what does that regenerative opportunity there look like?
Well, so the benefit, I think, of really downsizing to just what I'm growing for my own winemaking is that I get to be the decider for all the things, and so I can be truly, no ceiling in terms of the experimentation, as long as I can do the work and pay for whatever thing I need to be able to do that work. I can do as much experimentation as I want. It was a little different at the previous site. It's, when you're selling fruit commercially for other people, there are certain expectations and contracts involved about what you can do. And so I'm very excited to not only be starting again at a new baseline and meeting a new property sort of where it is, and then also to be able to kind of lift my own baseline level of curiosity in terms of what doing different things can actually mean for the wine itself. And then also just for bringing back together an ecology, a geometry of an ecosystem that I really would love to see where that takes the wine.
Yeah, because we talked before, and that geometry or that infrastructure, or that 3D vision of the vineyard, I guess, really is something that I've not heard that many people talk about, and something you focus on, especially with your forestry background, I guess. And so, what are the first steps to taking that approach? I think you were putting in some hedgerows, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So initially, just coming onto the site for the first time, I wanted to just be quiet for about a year, a whole entire season, and see what native seedlings were coming up, particularly the trees. We're in an oak dominated sort of ecosystem. And so lots of little, very first true leaf seedlings, and where those were coming up in the vineyard stand itself. We've actually, removed the vine that's closest to that to, allow those to come up. And over time, we'll see, how much more space they need. But for now, we're letting seedlings come up as they will. And then this year, my big goal was to install some true architecture, some structural diversity, especially around the edges, to provide some buffer and some wildlife cover, and then, food and forage for pollinators and all of those things, but really trying to create a multi-dimensional, kind of geometry of symbiosis, essentially. So working as much as possible with native shrubs and trees around the edges to sort of diversify the rooting depths of the perennials there, so that they can kind of commingle with the grasses and the forbs and all the other things that we have growing, and really start to reintegrate the sort of structure into the function of what the vineyard could be. Because I do think that we've lost a lot of integrity in terms of what different rooting depths and different sort of co-evolved relationships in these ecosystems could actually mean for wine quality, and not just wine quality, but the way that we become dependent on outside inputs for protecting these crops that, that we're growing. And there's a lot of natural infrastructure that is part of, that protective layer, that buffer system. And so really trying to explore where are the intersections between what the vines need and then what the ecosystem provides and also needs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because whenever you talk about architecture, I always think above ground, but of course that's so reflected below ground. And so having those different heights will, of course, make the root intermingling at different depths much better.
Right. And I think, we forget, because what we see is only the above ground pieces, but we forget, especially with trees, we talk about these savanna type ecosystems a lot in regenerative, because a lot of the big work in the Midwestern United States is about these grasslands and the perennial grass roots and how fibrous they are and how much biomass they produce underground, which is true. But what's interesting about trees, especially the trees in my ecosystem, is that for the first, almost decade of their life, they're putting all of that photosynthetic power into building a root system that is really about water and the durability of just their own capacity to survive is about creating a root architecture, and that root architecture often is what determines the depth of the water table. And when it's been lost largely to agricultural conversion, we lose that depth. And then the depth of, our water holding capacity becomes just the extent of whatever we have in the ground. And so I've actually seen a lot of sort of encouraging data and a lot of encouraging anecdotal results from different experiments that I've done in terms of putting in trees and what that actually means for water holding capacity. Because we maybe sort of underestimate what having trees in a system can do for water storage and water banking, but you can't replace that. You can't replace that sort of fracking root structure with anything else that we might put into a vineyard system. I mean, even our vines now are very, very limited in terms of like what layers of soil they're really exploring with their roots.
Yeah, interesting, because I think most people see a tree as a competition for water.
Yes.
But what I'm hearing you saying is that actually trees and hedges, they're providing that localized water cycle, and they're changing that localized water system, very localized, like literally the field that the vineyard's in. They're heavily affecting that, and that in drought or heavy rain scenarios that they are helping to buffer that. Is that fair? Or
totally. I mean, if you think about a field soil and its innate water holding capacity, which would be largely determined by the texture of your soil, which you can't really change a lot. I mean, you can increase your organic matter, which will, help a lot in terms of that, sort of top 8 inches water storage. And for our vines, yes, that's super important. But for the community and for our water catchment systems, that water storage capacity, again, is largely dictated by the deepest rooting perennials on the site and in the region. And so the more we have, let's say your soil holds 2 inches of water per foot, and that would be a pretty generous field soil. If you only have 1 foot really of fibrous roots, then, you're going to get 2 inches of water held in any given major rainfall event. If you increase that to 10 feet by putting in trees, even, on a very limited number per acre, I mean, like 1 tree per acre can actually increase that depth to 10, 20 feet. And then you get times 2 20 to 40 inches of rain that you can absorb in a major rainfall event. And that's changing sort of a regional climate durability. And in my mind, starting there, and to your point, there is a competitive discussion to be had. I mean, I don't deny that, especially at different ages and at different stages of what we would call succession, that you will have competitive forces at play as the system is coming into, kind of a homeostasis, if you will. And that's why I really like to start by putting in those deep rooting perennials, because as they grow, the capacity for a cooperative environment grows. You get more bang for your buck, I think, in terms of starting with the architecture, the biggest architectural features that you want to bring back, and then dialing in the details after that, because you increase the capacity. You need a big base to have a tall pyramid. And so one of the big things that I learned from the previous site, and also just the experiments that I've done over the years, is that you can't spend too much time building the base of that pyramid. The bigger it is and the stronger it is, the higher you can go with whatever else that you care to do. So you just build a bigger engine that way.
Okay, great. And so the engine is these deep rooting perennials, or that's the base of the engine. Got it. Love it. That would be quite a vision for the future if all vineyards just have trees kind of coming out across the vineyard, quite different than how things are today. Great. And are there any other experiments, or I know we were talking a little bit about how you were using actually the ground cover, and how that, again, it's an architectural element in a way, but it's like, how does that interplay with the canopy and reducing things like powdery issues? Yeah, maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. So the other, I think anybody who is in viticulture is at least moderately to extremely obsessed with their disease pressure. And that, that is less in a very arid environment, but they have then water issues to contend with. And so for us, we are a pretty drought limited growing season, very hot and very dry, but our spring and our winter are so wet that we have very significant powdery pressure. So one of my holy grails is really trying to figure out what the most, what are the least amount of passes we can do in the vineyard to have good powdery mildew control. And I think that, I'm still learning what that is. But one thing that I learned from last year is that, I had grafted my entire stand. I wasn't expecting to get any fruit. And so I only sprayed one time, and it was just a sulfur spray. And while we did see some mildew in the, especially in the laterals and at the tips of the shoots, we didn't see any on the fruit, which we did end up having, and I did end up harvesting. And so it was a really interesting data point. I don't want to extrapolate into the future from that, but I think that we really undervalue the floor of the vineyard in terms of what it can do for disease resistance and actually manipulating the humidity of the fruiting zone, manipulating the amount of water and when that water is available, and especially towards end of season when we are actually getting close to butting up against the beginnings of the winter rains. If we have a very late growing season, using that cover as a buffer in a heavy rain. So when we do have a late season, sort of during harvest or pre-harvest significant rainfall, that floor is what's going to absorb that water, as opposed to your very thirsty vine soaking it all up and then blowing up the berries and basically introducing a lot of potentially botrytis into the, the fruit that you've spent so much time on. And so I wanted to, with this new, experimental postage stamp, I wanted to see what we could do under the vine itself. And so I have a series of basically rows that have individual undervine cover crops that I've sown, mostly for pollinators and low growing, so that they don't grow up into the canopy itself. And then in the vine rows in the alleyways, we have a mixture of grasses and native plants and all, just kind of whatever was already there, and then increasing the amount of wildflowers and other things that we can just sort of encourage to come in over time. So we'll see, but we have meadow foam under the vine. We have a series of mixed clovers that are at different flowering, different periodicities of flowering, none of which are very tall. We have some sandfoin, which is another flowering plant that has really interesting secondary compounds that it produces. And what else did I use? Meadow foam, clover, and then we did a mix. We did a mixture of all of those things just to see how the vines respond, and then also whether or not they how long they flower during the season, and how they senesce, basically what the timing is, and whether or not I like how that timing plays with when the vines are sort of getting into the fruit ripening stage.
Amazing. Yeah, I think the low growing undervine canopy, undervine cover is like something that everyone is trying to, or not everyone, but people are really trying to figure out, especially in different climates. And thanks for sharing exactly what species you put in, because I think that is the question everyone's curious about. It's like, oh, what did you try?
Yeah.
And I think it is almost like a global experiment. Is everyone is got to have a go with different species and see what happens. And I don't know, do you have concern that you will get higher disease pressure from having undervine plants?
No, I learned enough from my previous site. So we did have undervine cover at the previous site, and there was quite a bit of grass even, and a lot of tall flowers like Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. And it would often grow up into the canopy. And what I found is that as long as, we did some good, careful, targeted leaf plucking, and then also, either manage that with grazing or we had an undervine tool. The most critical thing in that, in the sort of height of our growing season. So when things are growing 2 inches a day, this is how I think about it anyway. And anybody who's listening, I think it'd be great to have just a discussion about this, but you're most vulnerable to those fungal diseases when you're growing the fastest. And so if you think about even, I think about this from a forestry perspective, when you clear cut and then you replant with little tiny seedlings, those seedlings are going to grow very rapidly in their first couple of years. And I liken that to the beginning of our growing season. We have field capacity, moisture, our vines are just rearing to go. And so what happens then is that they grow very quickly, and their cells are very big, and they're very full of water, and they just lack a little bit of that structural integrity. And when the floor is very robust and diverse, it is also using those resources that would otherwise be only going for the vine. And I think that we focus a little bit too much coming out of the winter on what we want to see in terms of like a lush green growth of canopy. I would actually prefer to grow much slower during that period of time and have very small, very tight, very lipid dense cell membranes during that period of time and waxy cuticles. So I try to look for, sort of smaller internode length during that time and really count on that floor to retard that growth a little bit, because I think what you see then is more of a density of those phytonutrients and those products of photosynthesis staying in the integrity of those cells. And so the powdery pressure actually goes down as a result of having a more robust floor during that early season growing period. And if you're not growing 2 inches a day, and maybe you're only growing 3/4 of an inch a day, that's still plenty. We're still going to get to the finish line. And I think that's something that we don't think enough about in terms of disease pressure, is actually managing that most robust period of vegetative growth, which is when you are the most vulnerable to diseases like powdery and downy. If that makes sense.
Yeah, super. And yeah, again, I had never thought about it that way, so I really appreciate you bringing that perspective to it. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit because we're going to go to questions in about 15 minutes here. So if people do have questions, please do ask them in the Q&A area, and then we will come to them. So I wanted to, obviously you had this kind of amazing opportunity to start again. As we've heard many times in the regenerative world, there's no single recipe. So figuring out what to do next is a key part of the regenerative process in a way. And I'd love to hear a little bit about, how did you know where to start? Because you were starting again. And also, like, how do you decide what you're going to do next? And then maybe you could just talk to those a little.
Well, I think talking with you about this especially is very poignant, because what I've found, and one of the reasons I spent that whole first 3/4 to a year just making observations, is that when you are tracking things, when you are making those careful observations, not only does it sort of tell you where you are currently, but it makes you curious about different things that you might try. And if you just walk in and sort of do what you've always done, then there isn't a lot of curiosity there. There's not a lot to sort of take you on a path towards something new, or even point to where you might have room to really improve what you're doing. And one of the things that I did observe in that first year is that we had, this place had some pretty long-term, sort of no-tilled soils. They hadn't been disturbed for a long period of time. There was a fairly, kind of dense established thatch, if you will. And so I really felt like the biggest missing piece in that little area was the structural diversity, and really trying to start where we had some significant ground to gain. And that would be different if I went into another system. And another thing I think that has been very helpful for me is just walking out and having a way of organizing the things that you're paying attention to. So whether or not that's with sector mentor and you're going out and you put your hula hoop on the ground and you do a plant inventory, or you do an earthworm count, or you do whatever it is that you're doing, you start to see other things when you're looking that carefully. It was one of the big eye-opening experiences for me when I started doing biodynamic trials, is just that amount of time that you spend with a bucket and a paintbrush. It allows you to spend some very invaluable time making other observations. So for me, it's less about whatever's in the bucket and whatever's on the paintbrush than it is about what I can be thinking about when I'm doing that work. And what is interesting about this new place is that the soils are they're very different than the soils at my previous site. They're much more like the soils where I grew up. And when there is no cover under the vine, so there was a history of using an undervine cultivator there. And what I've observed is that that undervine cultivator, while it does make for a nice, kind of clean undervine space, we had some real capped soils under there. There was some real sort of obstruction to putting any type of vegetation on there. And so this seedling experiment, where we're trying to get that undervine area established, has been a little bit challenged by just the capacity for that. It's got a lot of clay. And so when it's wet, it's like super sticky. And then as soon as it starts to dry out, it's cement. And so we had to use some compost and do some different things, but it is really, I think the main point I'd like to drive home is that the biggest value, I think, of the observations that we record is that you're paying extra attention. It's less about what you're recording, which is invaluable, by the way, especially if you do it for a long period of time. But it's more just that you are paying attention and you're actually making other observations. Even if you don't think you are, you're making other observations at the same time.
Totally. Yeah, could totally concur with that. That's my experience as well. And so I know maybe now is a good time to just talk a little bit with the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. I know that you have, well, I'm happy if you want to share a little bit about it in general, but also you are putting together what I think you're calling the regenerative stages, or I can't remember exactly what it is, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how that might help people think about a regenerative path or journey.
Yeah, I think the coolest thing in my mind about this moment in time is that there are so many organizations out there that are, whether we're calling it regenerative or calling it sort of, the indigenous influence or whatever it is, traditional indigenous knowledge has made these observations for millennia that when you really try to humbly recognize what has been put in place by the pressures of evolution for a very long period of time, that as much as we can retain that integrity, the better. And now there are all of these organizations out there that are trying to pull together practices that are regionally specific, that are not just conducive to, but actually amplify what we can grow in a particular region. And what the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation is trying to be is really, kind of a catalyst or a vector for but connecting people with the resources that already exist that they maybe don't have access to, and then recognizing that everybody's going to be starting from a different place. And so one of our first tasks was the creation of this index. That's what it's called. And it's basically where, there's a set of questions that you ask and you just answer them as honestly as possibly about your system. And it will kind of identify areas. So whether that's about, converting to less tillage or eliminating synthetic pesticides and herbicides or whatever it is, where you are prepared to make progress, you can make progress. And it's not to try to put in front of you a set of very rigid expectations, but it's to really work with where your own curiosity drives you and where you feel you have the risk tolerance to try something new. And so the idea really is to say, we don't want to be another certification standard. There's quite a few of those out there and they're excellent. We really want to start connecting people with the information that they need to get started wherever that makes sense for them, because you can literally make progress in a multitude of ways. And it's really kind of up to what you think is going to feel most comfortable for you getting on that path. And thank goodness. It's so great. I know you would have things to say about this as well. But when I look back at when I was getting started and the limitations of the information that were out there for me, it was so much just like trying to learn in place, which is hard in an agricultural system because you only have that one, once a year feedback to really know what's working. And really you have to give it several years to actually know whether or not what you did made a difference. So I think this is such an exciting moment for that reason, to be able to be a part of connecting growers, not just where they are with the information that's relevant to where they are, but with others who are also getting on the path. Because that piece of it, I think almost trumps everything else, is that creating a community of support and the just the capacity to share what's working for you or what's not working for you. Everybody meets significant challenges and barriers on the path to doing a better job with the land. Our lands have been very underserved. And so the path back to health and resilience is oftentimes going to be challenged by just the innate nature of what, several hundred years of farming, even if it was pretty good farming, but especially if it was very extractive farming, there are going to be challenges. And so connecting people with that community of support to be able to give you that encouragement to keep going, or to try this other thing, or, apply for this grant or whatever it is. I mean, I think that's really critical work, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Totally agreed. And yeah, I think, is the index coming out soon?
Yes, we're, the answer is yes. And we are also so happy to have finally hired somebody who's going to be taking, because, we're a volunteer board. And so we've been working very hard, and Justin, who I know is on the call right now, has really been spearheading the index heretofore. And now we've been able to get Becky on board. Becky is our new hire, and she is very excited to get that sort of polished and into a consumable form where people can interact with it and, have it be kind of connectable to the resources and the people that they need to connect with.
Okay, great. So we have some really good questions. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we'll go to the questions. My question is just, I know that you did some experiments around tilled and no-tilled soils in a particularly hot year, and then also in some frosted situations. And maybe you could share a little bit about your data from those experiments.
Absolutely. So the to till or not to till is becoming just this is like, it's just like a sword to die on, basically, is the way I put it. And I think it shouldn't be that. I feel like there is a lot of, we need to have very open and vulnerable conversations, because what I have learned and what I have observed, specifically in vineyard systems where there are a lot of tractor passes, is that with different and very sort of careful and I would say more benign forms of occasional tillage with very robust and diverse cover crops, you can actually grow a significant amount of organic matter in a fairly short period of time, especially if you have a generous water year. So I don't want to say that it's not possible to grow organic matter when you are doing tillage, but what I can say without hesitation is that water dynamic has become a particular focus for me. And two of the main reasons that I choose not to till, even if I could potentially increase my organic matter a little bit more on an annual basis if I were doing some tillage, the two reasons that I choose not to do that are because of aggregate structure and mycorrhizal protection, because then we do know that that is a very significant disturbance for mycorrhizal fungi. And that does sort of hamper what they can do in terms of the continuity below ground of not just your vines, but of all the things. But the biggest one for me is about the water dynamic. So my region is trending towards more drought, more aridity, and what we've observed now in multiple years, but in the most significant year was the 2021 heat dome, where we had 5 days above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And, we were very close to 10 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And we took soil temperatures at the very hottest points of the day in both the untilled areas and then neighboring tilled fields, because we saw that heat dome coming. I mean, everybody knew that it was coming. And so there was a lot of tillage right before that happened. And so we were able to actually gather some pretty strong data points around that. And our untilled soils were 60 degrees cooler than the tilled soils just next door. And they were on the valley floor. So they should have, that should have been a protection. But then on top of that, our canopies were also on average 40 degrees cooler. And that is by virtue of just, transpiration still being able to be possible when we're holding that water in the soil. And then on the flip side of that, what's interesting is that we've had also some very significant frost pressure in the last couple of years. And what we've found is that when our soil moisture and when our soils are covered, our soils are warmer longer, so they resist frost. And there's this very long held belief that if you have a lot growing on the floor, it's a frost vector. And we've actually seen that to be the other way, where if we have cover, usually when we get frost, our cover crop hasn't grown up very high. And so it's not actually in danger of being a vector to the canopy, but it actually maintains a higher temperature and actually resists frost longer.
Wow, 60 degrees. It's every time I want to say, are you sure?
Yeah, I know.
It sounds mental.
It does. And what was really mental is that once you get to the temperatures that we were recording on the tilled soils, once you're approaching 200 degrees Fahrenheit, that's not biological. Your biology is no longer in the root zone. If it isn't dead, it has migrated downwards, and so it's not doing anything for your vines. And that really drove it home for me, at least in areas and people I work with who are even in more drought prone areas. That's something that I really try to encourage us to work towards, even if they can't get away from tillage, if we can at least do an experimental design where we do 1 block or even 3 rows, just because I think it's terrifying for people. I mean, these are significant pressures that we're under now, but you have to do a trial if you're going to convince yourself first. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to think about.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions. We've got some questions here. One from Filippo Maggioni. Sorry if I butchered that Italian name. Greetings from Southern Tuscany, he says. A bit of a challenge regarding your point of building perennial architecture by starting with larger, deeper rooting trees. I understand that in trying to regenerate an ecosystem and moving towards climax species, one generally ought to start with humbler pioneer species, usually rather bushes. Are these observations compatible, or is he missing something? For example, he says the deepest rooting plants aren't really the big climax species. I'm not 100% sure what climax species means, but I guess, is it starting with shrubs is another approach than starting with the deep rooting species? And are they compatible? Yeah. What would you say to that?
So I actually don't think there's any disagreement. I think it really depends on where your system is and what its starting point is. So if there are trees on site, I certainly wouldn't remove them unless, it's all a forest and you are truly converting it. And that's another discussion and not one that I care to get into today. But if there are trees, I would encourage people to leave them in place. And if you're starting with just baseline square one, my decision to put in trees and shrubs, I put in a whole bunch of shrubs. Oftentimes shrubs will have even deeper roots than trees. It just depends on the species. I didn't feel like I needed to use pioneer species in this particular case because it was not a significantly degraded piece of land. Like I said, we had no-till for a very long period of time. There was a lot of grass already established. pioneer species generally are appropriate in terms of talking about succession. So pioneer species are the ones that can germinate very quickly. They can establish root systems very quickly. I look at those when, they tend to be our most problematic, what we call weeds. And I don't, again, I don't take issue with them. They are doing a job, they're holding the ground. But if you have an established system already that is in relatively good health, then I don't see any reason to not go to something more intermediate or even getting close to a climax. And I don't know that I really believe that those terms are as relevant as they used to be. No ecosystem is going to be permanent. And so when we look towards homeostasis and stability, what I like to see is enough geometry and architecture that is appropriate for the region, with as many co-evolved species as possible that are relevant to that ecosystem, where the wildlife can depend on that food source and that cover source. And that's really what drives my decision making. And I would look at using colonizer species on a very degraded piece of land, potentially.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So the next question, I am going by what people have voted up. So vote things up if you want to get them to the top. But this is from Alex Fitton. It says, are there any examples of intercropped vines and trees on dwarf rootstocks in high density sequence rather than sporadic planting anywhere? And what research is there on the benefit to vines by creating mimicry of forest fungal networks in the soil by intercropping trees?
Yeah, so interestingly, this is kind of there's more than one question there, but I started looking into the literature to see if there was anything in the academic literature anyway about dwarf rootstock, say fruit trees that could be used on the same trellis as vines. I didn't find anything, and I don't know anybody who's doing that, but I don't know that they don't exist. I just don't know about them if they do. I think it's a really interesting question. I think anything on a dwarfing rootstock, it's kind of like vines, right? They're, the rootstocks are smaller, and that's what makes a smaller plant above ground. And so I'm trying to use as many sort of on their own roots systems as possible. But that's not to dissuade anybody from being experimental, because I think the diversity within the row itself is actually also very interesting when it comes to interrupting cycles of disease. And then I would just be looking at what species you're going to use and what diseases they might be sensitive to, and whether or not that's compatible for what you're trying to achieve. The other question about the fungal networks, which I think is a really good one, is trees have a different type of mycorrhizal partnership than our vines do. So it's ectomycorrhizae versus sort of the arbuscular mycorrhizae that we talk about in vineyard systems, which is not to say that it's not good to have that diversity, because we do see them interacting in field settings. So in natural forested settings, we do see those hyphal networks interacting with each other. But in terms of what they bring to the species independently, those things haven't been studied, at least to my knowledge, in how they would come together in an agricultural system. But I think it's a really interesting question. And for me, if what you're concerned about, and if what was driving that question was the lack of mycorrhizal fungi in vineyards, just because of their highly disturbed environments, and oftentimes moving more towards a bacterial dominated system, if you want to encourage more mycorrhizal colonization of your vines, having a wood source, a lignin source to be food for that, for the mycorrhizal fungi that do colonize our grape roots is a really good idea. Dan Rinke has talked about this a lot. I think he talked about it with you even, Abby, on one of your episodes. But one thing that I've experimented with both at my previous site, my current site, and at other places where I've worked with other people is actually drilling in cores of wood chips, just small sources, so that you're not, because when you apply wood chips, it can oftentimes tie up your nitrogen in strange ways and be a weird sort of imbalancing pressure for a while. But what has been interesting to me is that when we've done those cores, we've actually seen some pretty interesting responses, especially in a sort of radial design away from where we actually plant the cores. So that's something to try as well.
Really interesting. Yeah, I remember visiting Johan when Dan was there, and he did have little wood piles kind of randomly across the vineyard. I guess figuring things out in that direction. Okay, great. And then the next question is from Nicolau in Portugal. He says, can you tell us what is the height of your first wire or cordon? And what species do you seed or not under your vines? I know you did mention them, but maybe you could just re-mention them.
Yes. So the height of my fruiting wire, if you will, is about 3 feet. So not super high, but also not super low. And then what was the other question?
And what species do you seed or not under your vines?
Okay. So under the vines, I mean, we are looking to just do eventually have something permanent that reseeds itself or something perennial. So at the old site, I worked a lot with subclovers, the subterranean clovers that are, they're kind of mat forming. And that was hard because they were very slow to establish, but once they did establish, they were really good at especially choking out things like grass. And they also dry down at a period of time that's very compatible with when the vine really needs to start charging ahead, and it maintains that cover. So we had good hydration underneath, but I was interested at this site in doing some kind of pollinator highway. I work with a woman, Sarah Redlaird, who runs the Bee Girl organization, and really trying to have a food source for me at least, native pollinators. She's very interested in honeybees, but both of the things, and having a food source throughout the driest part of the season. So finding those late blooming. So that was one of the reasons for working with meadow foam and sainfoin, and then the 3 different clovers that we did in the blend to be able to sort of extend that flowering window. And so these will be more actively growing during the ripening cycle of the vines, and it'll be interesting to see what the response is for that. But I try to pick things based on the height of, when they peak, how high they are, how close they are to the fruiting wire, and then also when do they go dormant, and do they come back? Because I don't want to be disturbing that space ever if I can avoid it. So I'm really looking for something that will stay and be permanent. Totally. Great.
Thank you. Okay. Erin Rasmussen from Wisconsin. She says, it's very humid here, and the knowledge level of farmers regarding regenerative techniques is still lacking. So canopies get big and dense. I've been trying to encourage the growers to embrace companion plant growth among other techniques. How do you talk to people who may not realize the benefit in ecological diversity and don't see how non-vine plants might help reduce pest and disease pressure, among other effects? Any advice for opening minds?
Again, I think the most powerful driver for opening minds is having some observable feature to point to. A repeatable, observable feature. So where you can convince someone to do a trial that's the gold standard in terms of what I've seen being able to pique people's curiosity. And then short of that, I think really getting into the role of diversity beyond just it being a nice idea. So the idea of every plant species having not just above ground partners that it has co-evolved with. So whether that's insects that are predatory, beneficial insects that eat things like aphids and leaf hoppers and other sucking organisms, phylloxera. I mean, I could go down a rabbit hole if you wanted to on that. But then also below ground, each plant at the species level feeds its own multitude, not just a couple, feeds its own multitude of species underground, from predator to, the single-celled organism. So the more species you have growing in your vineyard, that becomes exponential underground in terms of who you're feeding. And we do know, and there's very robust science behind this, the more intact that below ground food web becomes, the more biomass can be produced above ground. And so if you think about the energetic potential of any particular piece of ground, the more layers of photosynthesis, the diversity of photosynthetic product that you can produce. So both what time of day, how big the leaf is, what shape the leaf is, all of those things are part of the energetic potential of your site. And if wines really are these just sort of time capsules of energy, the more we can put into that system, the more that is going to show up in the wine. And again, I would just say, make the wine because it will convince the people. And if you're not making wine, grow the strawberry, grow the piece of lettuce, whatever it is. We now are able to track the metabolomics of what is in our food, and we can relate that back to what our soils look like. And the more data points that we have, the better we are. So again, encouraging people to adopt methodologies of recording their information through things like Sector Mentor or whatever you want to use. Just having data to put in front of people is a very powerful stimulator for curiosity.
Totally. Okay, I'm going to speed up because we've got a few minutes left and there's a few more questions. So I'm going to go to the highest voted ones. So one is from Adam Foden. So when introducing species into the vineyard, should they be introduced based on species in the surrounding area, or can you introduce non-native imported species? In your experience, have you found any difference in the way they interact with the vines?
Yes. So what I've observed is that, and I have used ornamental plants in my diversity plantings just because, maybe that's all I could get. It's harder to find native plants. There are very few native plant nurseries in the world, but, in certain regions, it's really almost impossible. But I would say if you have a decision-making tree, starting with the species that are native to your area, they're going to be more robust in that area. They're adapted, they've co-evolved. Sometimes though, that soil environment or that localized environment has been degraded to a point such that you may need to start with other things. And so again, I encourage you to just be very curious about what your starting point is, and then start to identify baby steps towards eventually getting back to a place where the system has come back enough so that that seed bed that's latent, you have a native seed bed, it is there. Eventually, once you start to see some of those natives coming back on the floor, you might be able to introduce some of the, the more intense kind of perennial structures that are native to your area as well. But I encourage patience with that because it is very dependent on, how degraded the system is to begin with.
Right.
And the interaction with the vines is, the European wine grape, it's not native to any of these systems, right? And so it's really a case by case basis.
Great. Okay. There's quite a few other questions, but almost all of them have some element of establishing a vineyard. And what does a regenerative approach to establish a vineyard, or what are the principles you would take into account when establishing a vineyard? So I don't know, as a final question, if you could talk a little bit about how you would think about that. I know you didn't have to establish your vineyard at your new site, but yeah.
Well, establishment is going to be more and more of an issue, I think, as we move forward, because, this is a clonally reproduced thing that we've tied ourselves very tightly to, the European wine grape. And Vitis vinifera does not have a lot of innate disease resistance. No matter, you can grow the healthiest Vitis vinifera you can, and if you are in a very humid environment during the growing season, it is susceptible to certain pests and diseases. And it doesn't especially on rootstock, it does not like to be in very drought prone soils. And so I think that what we need now is to get very clear and be brutally honest with ourselves about establishment. I would love for the world to say, we are not going to convert any more native habitat to any agricultural crop, because we can feed the world and we can certainly produce enough wine if we never convert another piece of native habitat. And I realize I may be pissing a lot of people off by saying that, but if you are establishing and you want to do a good job, I would encourage you to grow the rootstock that you can get your hands on that is the most tuned in to where you believe your regional climate is going, and grow that rootstock for 3 years at least before you graft onto the top of it, because I think that that is the best system you can grow, unless you have the benefit of being able to do own rooted, which I think in some places is possible, but most places we're talking about going on to rootstock. And if you do it that way, then set it up so that your whole system can work the way that you want it to, but also in the way that will feed itself most healthily. So if you're going to do some type of agroforestry, get those trees going at the same time. If you're going to do no-till, and I encourage you to at least consider that, do that from the beginning. And that's another reason to start with rootstock. If you have water, use it very judiciously and only to get those plants established to the point where they don't need any more hand holding. And then I encourage everybody to reassess the trellis design so that it is compatible to things like grazing, which helps with nutrient recovery and nutrient cycling. And if not grazing, then whatever type of equipment is going to facilitate the most benign and least disturbance situation that you can imagine. So vineyard design, not just establishment, but vineyard design, I think, is something that we need to look very carefully at. And it would look different depending on where I was in the world, but that kind of gives you a sense of just the pantheon of things I would be thinking about.
Multi-layered. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mimi. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer every single question, but I think that's basically and sort of answered them at least to a certain extent. And yeah, just thanks for all of your insights and sharing your learnings. I really, really appreciate it. And I think everyone here, we've had many people saying thank you for your sharing. So we all really appreciate it. From my perspective, if anyone wants to hear more about Sector Mentor, you can send us a direct message in the chat and we can email you and get back to you. And then for everyone, we will send a follow-up email later this week, probably Friday, with a video of this recording and links to some of Mimi's blog posts and the podcast you've been part of, as well as anything that's relevant to the conversation we've just had.
Well, Abby, I appreciate you so much, and I am so in awe of everything that you're putting out there. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you guys today. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Toodaloo.